In the summer of 1878, amidst the scorched remains of the Staintives, home for orphaned girls, a soft-spoken carpenter named Elijah Corbin was sent to inspect the attic beams for anything that might still be salvaged. But what he found was not a beam, and not a shadow of one. Instead, half buried in soot and ash, untouched by flame, was a crate, bone dry, iron hinged, wax sealed. And yet, somehow, that wax hadn't cracked, hadn't melted, hadn't even softened in the firestorm that had consumed every room around it. Inside, a brass-lensed lantern projector, strangely pristine, and 12 glass slides hand-labeled in a script no one recognized. Many were still bound neatly in faded blue ribbon, but it wasn't the age of the artifacts that made Corbin pause. It was what they showed. Places no one remembered building. Rooms that didn't exist in any blueprint, certainly not in the Baptist Sisters' official plans from 1871. Children posed faintly in impossible architecture. Hallways that defied logic. Chalkboards with lessons in languages no one spoke. A doorway that led nowhere. One slide bore a simple charcoal mark, 1893. Another a funeral procession, held 3 towns away. Only it wouldn't take place for another 4 years. And among the mourners, a solemn-eyed boy whose name had never been written in any county record. His surname was Corbin. In the last entry of Elijah Corbin's journal, dated the very week he vanished, he wrote, "It doesn't record what happened. It shows what must keep happening." Today the lantern still exists. It rests in a sealed drawer in a Mercer County archive, bound in iron, logged but unclaimed. No one has ever officially asked for it, but the story, somehow, the story continues. And now, if you're listening, it's projecting through you. So, if you're ready to step deeper into the macabre mystery of the box of seeing reach for the switch, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and know you're not watching alone. And if you're here right now, wherever you are in the world, leave a trace below. Tell us your country. Tell us the time, because there's something strangely comforting in knowing we are all out there, scattered across continents, scattered across hours, yet witnessing the same impossible story unfold. In the early spring of 1878, just a few miles west, the last barn still standing behind the charred remains of the St. Harmon's Orphan Refuge was finally scheduled for dismantling. The estate, once maintained by the devoted Sisters of St. Hildegard, had been abandoned since a fire in 1859. A fire that left no survivors, no documents, and curiously, no formal investigation. For nearly 2 decades, the blackened foundation stood untouched. No restoration, no development, just rusted gates and whispers in the wheat fields. That spring timber was scarce. Owensville's masons were dispatched to scavenge what lumber remained from the skeletal barn. And it was there, beneath a collapsed feed chute and the remains of a scorched roof brace, that the second crate was found. It was heavy, roughly the size of a small church tabernacle, iron trimmed and linen wrapped. Though blackened by smoke, the crate was eerily intact. But what unsettled the men most was the smell. It wasn't soot. It wasn't rot. It was something preserved, almost medicinal. The linen wrappings had been sealed with beeswax, hardened over time in such a way that it seemed to resist even flame itself. Later, when opened by the Mercer County notary, the interior released a sharp, sterile scent. Inside, another lantern, similar to the first, unmarked, cylindrical, and oddly weighty. And beside it, 12 more slides, perfectly clear, untouched by ash, resting in velvet-lined trays. Presuming it might hold estate records from before the fire, the county transported the crate to the Mercer recorder's office. But it bore no writing, no label, no clue to its maker or its purpose. Most unnerving of all, there was no soot inside. On May 2nd, 1878, the county quartermaster filed this strange observation. Interior clean. Slides without label. Apparatus warms but emits no smoke. Origin unknown. It was that final line that captured the attention of Elijah Corbin. Corbin, a retired seminary historian with a long-standing obsession with the fire at St. Harmon's, had quietly collected notes, rumors, and contradicting records for years. The orphanage, once home to over 40 children, had gone up in flames during Lent. A vague coroner's note suggested the fire began in the rectory and swept through the upper dormitories before sunrise. Not a single child was found. The sisters' burial register, retrieved weeks later from a neighboring parish, listed only 12 names, but official intake ledgers suggested 27 or more were present that year. So when Corbin heard of the crate, he wrote to the county with a direct and haunting request. Objects untouched by fire that survive fire. These are not merely items. They are refusals. That's how Elijah Corbin described the images in his earliest pages, though, to what he never quite said. After receiving the crate, Corbin brought the lantern home to Salvisa, a quiet stretch of woods not far from the old seminary where he'd spent most of his life. In the upstairs study of his weathered cottage, he converted the small second-floor room into a projection chamber. Curtains were drawn. The furniture was rearranged. Every light source was sealed or redirected. His tone at first was that of a man merely curious, cautiously skeptical, perhaps mildly amused by the mystery. But that tone changed. Gradually, quietly, until it gave way to something far more consuming. Each glass slide was about the size of a clerical folio, meticulously painted in layers so fine they appeared blank to the naked eye. Only when backlit through the lantern's beam did their contents appear. And what they revealed was unsettling. Children seated in rows, always facing forward, their arrangement disturbingly symmetrical, their expressions faint, eyes wide, posture perfect, their clothes modest, seasonally correct, but their surroundings wrong. The walls behind them bore no known design. The windows opened onto fields and meadows that didn't appear on any map. Some rooms contained furniture consistent with East Coast styles from the 1870s, but none that matched any surviving catalogue from St. Harmon's. Corbin's handwriting, once clean, structured, grew erratic by page 10 of his notebook. The lines narrowed. Margins overflowed with bracketed thoughts notes in faded pencil parentheses within parentheses. One passage underlined, twice, read, "These children are not familiar. And yet, they feel remembered." Another dated June 1st. The crate waited, as if buried, to be found. No agency, religious or civil, ever claimed the crate. The Diocese of Lexington issued a one-sentence reply. The records of St. Harmon's perished in the fire. When Corbin submitted a formal inquiry to the State Historical Society, seeking staff lists, building schematics, insurance records, he received no response. Weeks later, an envelope arrived. It bore the Society's seal. It had been resealed with fresh wax. Inside, nothing. The cloth lining of the crate showed no scorch marks. The velvet slide tray, no dust. Nowhere, no scent of age. In daylight, Corbin noted the slides shimmered faintly, not from the surface, but from beneath it, as though the images within were still resisting form. In the final entry of that first notebook, Corbin wrote vertically along the page's edge, "They are not echoes of what was. They are rehearsals of what returns." No letters followed that summer. And the last county ledger entry about the crate before it was quietly redacted mentioned something more. There had been a second tray beneath the velvet. A false bottom appeared locked from the inside. The lantern itself sat atop Corbin's writing table like a sculpture carved from contradiction. Brass-lensed, faintly grooved, and impossibly heavy for its size. Its casing bore no mark of origin, no signature, no plate, no maker, no date. Even after long use, it remained cool to the touch, and it responded to fire. Strangely, Corbin, a man who had spent 40 years at the seminary archives in Frankfurt, whose faith lay in vellum and glue and verifiable record, was not prone to whimsy. But the lantern refused categorization. His first technical note, dated May 6, 1878, reads, "It warms, but does not heat. And its mirror has no interest in fire." He tested it carefully. First with a taper, then whale oil, then carbide fuel borrowed from the Salvisa telegraph station. In every case, the lantern accepted light but did not react to it. The mirror refused to reflect open flame. The chamber never emitted smoke. And oddly, he observed the projection worked best when the source of light was entirely hidden. No aperture could be opened. No inner chamber revealed. It was as if the machine did not welcome examination. Corbin's first 3 slides were tested late one evening under filtered lamplight. He had sealed the study door with a felt rug, draped the windows in thick wool curtain, and hung a thin cotton sheet across the far wall to serve as a projection screen. At first, the slides showed nothing but color. Rust red, dust gray, amber pooling at the edges. But when he adjusted the lens, shapes emerged. Children, seated in rows, upright, still, not smiling, not distressed, just waiting. Their posture was flawless, their eyes unwavering. None of them blinked, none turned. It was the stillness that first disturbed Corbin. In his notebook, he described the room in slide 1. Modest parlor design, green damask drapes, spindle-legged chairs, possibly a Virginia pattern. The details were sharp, precise, yet eerily out of place. A room that had the scent of familiarity, but the shape of something imagined. And now, here we are, a century and a half later, still staring at that first image through Corbin's own eyes, still trying to understand what the children were waiting for, and why we, those watching now, feel like we've seen them before. If you're still with me, take a moment to pause. Breathe. Let the shadows settle, and if something in this story stirred something in you, leave a trace below. Your country, your hour. We're all scattered, but in moments like this, the distances collapse, the slides glow again, and the rehearsal begins anew. Later that evening, Elijah Coben attempted to reproduce the wallpaper from the first slide by hand. What he sketched matched precisely with a floral print found in the 1856 Clark Thomas catalogue from Charleston. But that discovery only raised more questions. St. Harmons, by all surviving records, had no budget for anything of the sort. The 1857 requisition ledger, still readable beneath soot stains, listed only bare pine untreated. No damask, no carpet, no embroidery. Just function and frugality. The floor in the projected image was polished dark and waxed completely at odds with the stone tiling, marked clearly in the blueprints of the East Hall where morning lessons were supposedly held. Then came slide 2, a new figure. A girl with red ribbons, precisely tied, unnaturally vibrant in hue. She sat before a mantel clock unmoving. Coben tracked down the model, a cast-iron Emerson decorated with a acanthus leaf trim. Mail-ordered from Ohio. Manufactured in 1862, but the fire at St. Harmons occurred in 1859. The clock should not have existed. Not in that room. Not with that girl. Not in that time. He wrote in his notebook, "If posed, it is the most deliberate staging I have ever witnessed. If natural, then something rehearsed." He began to measure light. Slide 3, dimmer. More fragile, showed 3 boys standing near a tall, narrow window. 4 panes high, its corners frosted. Outside, trees bending westward, caught in some remembered wind. Using the angle of shadow beneath their shoes, Coben estimated the scene as shortly after 9 a.m. But again, this contradicted the original layout. St. Harmons had no east-facing windows in its rear assembly hall. The side of the building pictured in the slide, according to the soot-damaged vellum blueprints preserved by the Sisters of St. Hildegard, was designated cold storage. Non-residential, no windows, no assembly. The more Coben observed, the more fragmented his writing became. Margins filled with sketches, folds of curtains, carved molding clock hands, collar seams. He noted the children in slide 3 bore no resemblance to those in the first or second. No repeated faces, no reused clothing, no thread connecting them except the arrangement. Each group was spaced with eerie precision, the same posture, the same quiet, the same suggestion, not of memory, but of waiting. They await instruction, he wrote, not recollection. By May 10th, Coben had stopped sleeping through the night. Neighbors who rarely saw him outside his garden gate noted his chimney had gone cold. But the house remained lit. A local postman, passing at dusk, described the glow from the upstairs study as like fire without flame, a room remembering how to burn. When asked, Coben answered politely but distantly. His eyes were often fixed on something behind you, something just beyond the reach of shared conversation. He was seen carrying the slides in and out of his study, carefully wrapped in dampened cloth, though the weather had turned dry and warm. On May 12th, he folded a piece of muslin over the lantern and sealed it inside a wood-lined drawer. His final entry that week read, They do not reflect light, they prepare it. The warmth is not to comfort, but to permit passage. No new experiments were recorded until June. When Corbin returned to the crate, he noticed something odd. Slide 4 had shifted forward. Not broken, not out of place, just nearer to the edge, as if something within had chosen it. At the same time, he turned to another question, one that had long troubled him. The children in the images, who were they? The intake registers of St. Harmon's had been water damaged during the fire, but remained legible enough to build a crude census. 76 children listed over 13 years of operation. Each name, each date of arrival, each place of origin, all recorded in slow, reverent handwriting. Corbin, precise as ever, copied them into his own ledger. He drew columns, aligned birth years, made careful notations about parentage where it was known, and then he compared those names to the faces projected in his study. There was not a single match, not one. He allowed for natural changes, aging, artistic interpretation, distortion by light or pigment. But the mismatch wasn't subtle. It was stark. The children in the slides were not simply unknown, they were unrecorded. Even their clothes, while accurate to the period, were wrong in a different way. Too fine, too tailored. No mending, no stains, no uneven seams or mismatched buttons. Lace collars lay perfectly flat. Stockings had no snags. Skirts fell with exacting geometry. These were not images of orphans. They were portraits, deliberate, curated. He wrote, "These are not boys and girls from St. Harmon's. They are boys and girls who knew of St. Harmon's." In an effort to confirm this theory, Corbin traveled to the diocesan archive in Harrodsburg, requesting a comparison against the wider Sisterhood adoption registry. He was met with tight-lipped refusals. The registers, he was told, have been sent east for rebinding. When asked who had sent them, or when no record could be produced, one clerk mentioned in passing that the boxes had been unboxed, then reboxed, unopened. Back in Salvisa, Corbin stopped relying on the slides. He began drawing the faces from memory. He was no artist, but he understood proportion, and the faces, even weeks later, had not left him. Not in dreams, not in daylight, not even when the lamp was dark and the drawer sealed tight. If you've made it this far, maybe you feel it too. The feeling that something isn't being shown to you, but shown through you. If so, pause with me, take a breath, and leave a trace. Where are you watching from? What time is it? Because something tells me we're all closer than we think. And the next slide is nearly ready. The children's features defied distinction. Their mouths remained closed, their eyes fixed directly ahead. None turned their heads. None smiled. Elijah Corbin noted that their hair was always parted in nearly the same spot, as though groomed by an unseen hand. Clothing varied. Backgrounds shifted. But posture remained constant. They weren't posed for photographs in the traditional sense, but paused as if captured in the middle of motionless breath. Slide 6 displayed a girl, perhaps 8, with a faint constellation of freckles and the slightest downturn to her lips. She stood before an open window, drapes parting, to reveal a strange motif, cross-hatched vines trailing clusters of alternating berries. Her left hand rested lightly on the windowsill. Her right was a blur caught mid-gesture. Outside stretched a field interrupted only by 3 distinct stones arranged in a triangle. There was no known room in St. Harmons that afforded such a view. In the margin of his sketch, Corbin had scribbled, "Seen in Danville, 1872. Stone number 3 bears notch." He had seen this girl before, or someone very much like her. He found the resemblance again in a yellowed clipping from the Advocate Messenger 4 years prior. The article reported the disappearance of a farmhand's daughter, identified only by the initials LCC, last seen walking toward a grove of trees at the edge of her family's land. Relatives described strange behavior in the days leading up to her vanishing. She had taken to sitting for long stretches before a broken parlor mirror, hands folded in her lap. Beneath her mattress, they found a note. It read, "I will sit right this time." Her body was never recovered. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but it was close enough that Corbin requested a photographic reproduction of the clipping. Back in his study, he compared the girl in slide 6 to the newspaper image. The jawline was slightly narrower, the hair parted on the opposite side, but the left ear bore a distinctive notch, a small heel tear often caused by a snagged earring. More clippings followed. Slide 8. A boy whose face matched that of an unidentified mute child found wandering the outskirts of Winchester in 1869. The boy had been taken in by the county and placed under observation. 3 weeks later, he vanished. Slide 10. A child's expression mirrored that of a painted portrait once hanging in a rural orphanage in Laurel County. The painting had been lost in a flood. No one remembered the sitter's name. No records remained. Each new match brought not confirmation but erosion. Erosion of time, of place, of certainty. Corbin's handwriting began to change. His formerly fluid script tightened into angular, anxious loops. He stopped writing dates. He began recording only locations. His notes turned to questions. Most remained unanswered. Where is the stone field? Were these rehearsals? Is memory spatial? The most unsettling note came without context. Next to a hurried sketch of a girl holding a wicker basket, Corbin had scrolled, "None of them are first versions." He left the tray of slides untouched for days. But when he returned to his attic to sort and catalog them, he noticed slide 2 had shifted. Its top edge was tilted just slightly inward, and beneath it, faint but clearly visible, was a single fingerprint in dried ink. It was not his, it was not smudged, and it had been pressed from the outside. Corbin turned next to the architectural plans, preserved under layers of smoke-stained linen and filed in the diocesan archive under designation ORF SCH 57 Blue. The blueprint of St. Harmons, dated March 1857, bore the signature of architect Josiah B. Minton. It detailed every stairwell corridor and dormitory, each element constructed with monastic restraint. The building was designed for austerity. No skylights were authorized, no ornamentation beyond sparse scripture plaques affixed to stone, only 2 classrooms, a shared chapel, modest sleeping quarters. And yet, the slides contradicted every line. Corbin laid the blueprint flat across his attic floor and weighted its corners with brass inkwells. Lantern at his side, he sat cross-legged and began matching each projected image to the layout. Slide 1, a narrow room with a fluted column in the near right foreground and a vertical skylight above. The child's shoulder cast a shadow, consistent with eastern morning light, sun rising behind and to the left. But no such room existed on the plans. No columns, no vertical skylights, no ceilings high enough for such natural illumination. And yet, the light obeyed no trick. At that latitude in that season, the sun would have passed just so. Slide 4 red floral damask wallpaper, a dark walnut mantle. Sconces built for gaslight. But St. Harmons had never installed gas. Its heating records listed only iron stoves. The fire marshal's 1859 post-burn testimony confirmed no trace of gas piping had been found in the ruins. Still, the slide showed unmistakable flicker light, low and warm, consistent with a functioning sconce. The wallpaper disturbed Corbin most of all. Its pattern tugged at something in memory. He traced it by hand and hours later uncovered an identical motif in an advertisement from Griggs Hanover Decorative Papers. Dated 1858 after the final approval of the blueprint. He circled the date, then crossed it out. Corbin was no longer sure whether he was examining a building or a cleverly disguised negation. The structure in the third photograph, with its unusual arched ceiling, did not appear to exist on any of the orphanage's official building plans. And it wasn't just the lack of documentation. The room, if it existed, must have been added after the main building was completed. Any such alteration would have required diocesan approval, but there was no paperwork to suggest that any had ever been submitted. The further Corbin delved into the study, the further his language in his notes drifted from architecture and into the realm of the absurd. He began to use phrases like impossible symmetry, simulation of space and real shadows in false structure. He no longer wrote of the photographs as images but as fragments of reality that were eerily accurate reproductions of reality. In the margins, he drew vaults that rested on nothing, ceilings that tilted at angles that couldn't have been possible from the building's measured height. The plan said the attic was only about 7 feet high, but one of the photographs showed the cornice at least 12 feet above the heads of the seated children, with no hint of perspective. Corbin tried folding the plan in different ways, trying to rotate the seams in a vain attempt to match what the photos told him to believe. He even created a caption called Coincidences of Light and Room, 1857-1871, which included the path of the sun, the central equinox, and the reflections on the tiles. The last line circled in red, these rooms were not built here, but they were lit by the sky. Listen. It was at this line that Corbin changed his tune. A man who had been obsessed with logbooks and hospital admissions was now interested in location, not just of architecture, but of presence. From there, strange terms began to appear, floor below adjacent heritage. In a barely legible note, he wrote on the edge of the page, "Build where there is nothing. Remember where there is no fire." A letter to the State Architectural Survey was rejected. A request to the Lexington Historical Commission, hoping to find clues about a secret 1857-1859 expansion, was returned intact, sealed with glue stamped. Property not under current jurisdiction. Corbin underlined the line twice in red. He began to believe that the rooms were never recorded because they were never meant to be known. And yet, they had survived long enough to catch the light of the sky, to leave the children sitting inside that false geometry. One sleepless night, Corbin redrawn the entire architectural plan, this time in reverse order, from the east corridor back to the west. The ink faded the compass notes unfinished. Finally, he did something strange. He took one of the slides and attached it to the blueprint in wax. It completely obscured the north stairwell. On the back of the glass, he wrote in shaky ink, "If the room is not found, then what burned?" The next morning, the blueprint curled at the corners as if it had been heated, even though no lights had ever been turned on in the room. And then came the fifth photograph. If you're listening and feeling a shiver, you're not alone. This is where it becomes more than a technical error. It becomes a betrayal of memory itself. The previous 4 pictures, however strange, remain the same with each viewing. The misaligned lighting, the nameless children, the unreal room. But the fifth was different. It changed. Not in a vague mind-tricking way. It changed. Corbin had first seen it in late May. He had described it in detail. Girl sitting hands clasped in lap, triple-paneled door behind northern alcove striped shawl. He had redrawn the girl's hairline, marked the folds in the shawl, and made a clear note that the wall behind her had no soot. But when he came back the next day, the girl's expression was different. Her chin was more lowered. Her gaze was no longer direct. And the wall behind her now had faint vertical streaks like smoke or rain and ash running down it. He took the slide out and held it under the light. There were no signs of impact. No scratches, no fingerprints. Everything was perfect and still different. He thought it might be a mechanical fault or a memory flaw. But when he went back to his notebook, comparing sketch after sketch, every difference was there. Corbin was quiet. Then he became more precise. He used a pencil to trace the new lines of the image and placed them next to the previous day's notes. No match. Are you awake? If so, ask yourself, if a photograph can change without being touched, then what has really changed the photograph? Or the world? It reflects. The fifth slide was different. There was a slight change in the angle of the nose. The slanted light made the cheekbones look different. But what worried Corbin most? The 3-panel window, which had been blank now, had a bar across the top, though the frame was the same. He wrote only one line: same frame, same image, new darkness. This was not recorded. But from then on, Corbin became more careful. Every time he examined the fifth slide, he would look at the ones before and after it again and again. They did not change. Still motionless, cold, frozen in time. Only the fifth slide refused to stay still. He changed the bulb, rotated the projection surface, adjusted the focusing lens. The result was the same. Something had drifted. Confused, maybe afraid, Corbin put the projector back in the wooden box, closed the lid, and nailed it shut. The sound of the hammer echoed downstairs. He left the box of nails outside the study door, but the ladder to the attic remained. That night, Corbin moved his folding bed upstairs. From then on, he slept next to the box. By the second week of June, he had not left the upper floor except to get water. A neighbor said that Corbin had turned the face of the living room clock to the wall. During the day, the curtains were always drawn. The postman from Frankfurt, who had dropped off packages later, recalled that Corbin's staircase smelled strangely beeswax vinegar and old pine. The house had become a sealed relic. No one was allowed to touch it until something shapeless was done. Corbin's handwriting began to thin. The pages of his notebooks were filled with short circular sentences that hypnotized him. Same photo, different room. Closer. Soot is not soot. Soot is an odor. He began to sketch the black streaks that appeared behind the girl in the photo. A thin, vertical, regular line of smoke, like the residue of a chimney fire. Though there had never been a fire in the previous photo, the girl had changed too. She no longer looked childlike. Her cheekbones had lengthened. Her skirt, which had been knee-high, now hung down to her ankles. He had guessed she was about 10. Now, after her third viewing this week, she looked 14. There was a slight crease in her forehead, faint but real. On June 14th, Corbin sent a letter to the Kentucky Historical Research Commission asking about photochromic changes in high humidity. No one answered. A second letter was returned, marked "Not within scope." Corbin underlined the words in red ink. Then he stuck the envelope on the attic wall next to the carbon copy of the girl's new barred window. From then on, he stopped writing dates in his notebook altogether. He wrote that the projector, when turned back on, did not need any light. Just the faint twilight was enough. And in that fading light, like fading memories, the year slide was clearer than ever. The shadow from the barrier lengthened. Her posture changed. Now leaning to the right, her hands no longer in her lap, but pressed straight down on her thighs. Her face did the same. The left half seemed tense, hiding something she was trying to hold back. The last page he wrote in June was on the back of a receipt for a purchase of parchment. The letters were small and crowded, not a memory recorded. A memory returned. She was not being photographed. She was preparing. That same week, a carpenter passing by the Corbin house noticed that the shutters upstairs had been removed. In their place were black cloths stretched from the inside, absolutely not letting in any light. When the worker asked, Corbin quietly handed him a folded sheet of paper. On it was the 5th slide, before the change. The girl was still smiling. The wall behind her had not yet been stained with smoke. In the corner of the page, a faint, almost erased pencil line. She never looked forward. The 6th slide appeared. Unlike any of the previous ones, all the previous shots, quiet, creepy, had been symmetrical children sitting lined up the architectural background, balanced. But not this one. Just a girl, barefoot, hair loosely braided, standing next to a wooden crate. The floor was rough planks sunken in the middle, worn by years of repeated walking. She tilted her head to the left, her chin down. Not shyly, but as if interrupted by an unfinished movement. The light fell on her collarbone unevenly, like it was pouring from a skylight or a high vent. No tables, no doors, just her, the crate, and the damp floor. Corbin took notes more slowly this time. He drew the scene twice. The second version added an outline where the crate handle might have been lifted. He marked the faint scratches near her left heel like a drag mark. Maybe a mistake. But after many revisions, the detail was still there. Are you still following? If you're listening late at night, you might have sensed Corbin's heartbeat, slowing, tightening, then not the same. Breathe. We're not at the end. This is just a door opening. Are you ready for the next one? The deeper Elijah Corbin studied the 6th slide, The more he became convinced, this girl had not simply been photographed. She had been moved or was preparing to move. And somehow her room sealed, windowless, eerily static, was a place without exits. And perhaps without consequence. It wasn't until early July that Corbin discovered the name Merilla Kay. Tucked inside a yellowed back issue of the Stanford Herald, a regional paper from Lincoln County, he found it. The obituary was sparse, barely a paragraph in a larger column, cataloging 4 deaths that week. It read, Merilla Kay, aged approximately 10, found deceased in a dry well behind a tenant cabin near Turner's Knob. The well has held no water since at least 1866. No signs of trauma. No next of kin. She had not fallen. She bore no wounds. It was as if she'd simply lain down at the bottom of a forgotten well and expired. No family came forward. No birth record surfaced. The county buried her in a simple shroud, unclaimed and unnamed. Her name, if it was even hers, was written in the log as unnamed female approx. 10. Merilla Kay. Question mark, handwritten. Elijah stared at the slide again. He didn't think it was her. He knew. It wasn't in the features alone, it was the jawline, the uneven braid, the faint birthmark just above the left brow. These weren't similarities. They were identifiers. The likeness is not a comparison Corbin scribbled in his notes. It is a restaging. He reached out to the Lincoln County clerk to request the full coroner's file. The reply came in an envelope that was too new, too clean to have come from a dusty records office. Inside one paper, no seal, no letterhead. It simply read, no further records retained. Burial site unmarked. No investigation made. Corbin underlined the word retained, then circled it twice. That night, he began compiling a new ledger, what he called the post-image ledger. A separate notebook, more compact, more meticulous. He began collecting the names of orphaned, unidentified, unresolved children. Merilla was the first of 10, and that's when Corbin turned his attention to the projector. Now, if you've been with us for a while here at Sleepy History Tales, you'll know that this is never just about objects. It's about what they show us and what they refuse to explain. He borrowed a jeweler's loupe from a watch repairman and examined the machine. No gears, no ribbon, no visible path for the flame to reach the slide. Beneath the brass casing, he discovered a panel of scorched tin, holding 2 curved mirrors, convex, slightly tarnished, and unlike any modern construction. The slide chamber had no soot, no signs of burning, no film, no pigment residue, and yet the detail. It was far beyond brushwork. On the 6th image, the braid ended in a single flyaway strand, no thicker than sewing thread. Under direct light, her tiny toes bore the faint shadows of nails. The bucket near her hand showed slats warped by moisture and age-realistic imperfections, not artistic flourishes. This is not artifice, he wrote. It is documentation without authorship. He stopped calling them slides. In his journals, they became correspondences. The 6th image was now Correspondence 6, Standing Room. Subject, MK. The implication was chilling. The projector wasn't showing an image. It was engaging with it, as if each frame wasn't a picture, but a point of contact. In the margins, his notes grew stranger. She left no footsteps, he wrote in a pale hand. Perhaps she was never walking. Then one morning, he noticed something. A small soot-grey smear in the lower right corner of correspondence 6. It hadn't been there before. It looked like the faint outline of another pail. Corbin said nothing aloud, but he sketched it in the margin. That evening he did something peculiar. He placed a glass of water beneath the floorboards of the attic. Not for himself, for her. By midsummer, the house at the end of Chandler's Hollow had changed, or perhaps it had simply drifted quietly out of step with the rest of the world. Corbin, once a respected presence in the dusty halls of Harrodsburg's archives, stopped writing. The tidy formal letters, once peppered with phrases like respectfully requesting and awaiting your kind reply, ceased. When a rare envelope did arrive, the postmaster found no return address, no date. Inside, only a charcoal rubbing of a shoe print smaller than any child's. Underneath, a single word, revised. The gate to Corbin's property, a low iron arch secured with brass chains, had been locked since the last week of June. Above it, he had hung a hastily painted, handwritten sign that simply read, "Internal business underway. Do not disturb." No further explanation was offered, and no one asked. The townspeople, accustomed to Corbin's reclusive ways and vaguely respectful of his connections to the diocese and the ancient archives, quietly let the gate rust through the seasons. But inside the house, a quiet transformation had begun. The attic, where the mysterious wooden box had first been opened, was now the only room with light. There was no visible light, just a faint flickering glow, like the embers of a nearly extinguished fire. Neighbors who passed by at dawn said they saw shadows pass by, the windows slender figures not always matching Corbin's height or gait. The accounts varied, but they all agreed on one strange point. The shadows did not appear at night, but in the earliest moments of the morning, when light should have barely crested the eastern hills. Corbin had begun sleeping next to the projector and the box of slides. He had carried his cot up to the attic himself and set it against the east wall between a trunk full of ink-stained notebooks and a partially dismantled wooden crate. Near the bed was a basin of water and the desk that had once been a place for plans. Note cards, pencil sketches, and pieces of floorboards glued to the edges. The attic smelled more sour now, old wax-rotting cloth and fermented vinegar, but also like burnt paper, doused too late. Corbin's handwriting had changed too. Once a neat academic typeface, it was now thin, strained, distorted. There were no margins, no page numbers. The sentences were broken like gasps for breath in the middle of an unfinished thought. Entry 61 was undated, containing only a single line. Glass 8 repeat. The window is now broken. A shoe is missing. In entry 65 he wrote, "They change after being seen or while being seen." In entry 67, the pen seemed to linger longer, as if for the first time he were allowing himself to believe, this is no illusion. This is the shape of duty. The children are not dead. They are waiting to be seen again. Not remember, not imagine, but look back. Projection, Corbin says, is no longer an act of storage, but a ritual, almost a devotion, though there is no theology involved. The projector, in that sense, has become an altar. None of the scriptures that hang on the stairwell wall, not even the framed page of the Ecclesiastes, which had been there since his father's death, have been taken down. Face down, and placed under a sheet near the attic door. The glass in the frame is cracked in one corner. The lower level where the personal library once stood is empty. Chairs are pushed into the corners, the floor in the middle cleared as if in preparation for some action. Something that requires space. A neighbor who passes by at dusk reports hearing a scraping sound, a soft, steady sound like furniture being moved across a wooden floor. But when they call up to the window, no one answers. When the Lexington Historical Society tried to contact Corbin to retrieve the borrowed episcopal registers, they were met with silence. A courier was sent and returned with the news that the porch steps were covered in some kind of ink blotchy and damp. The door remained locked. No reply. Finally, the society simply marked the file as overdue, no punishment. In the attic, Corbin had pinned a new document to the wall. The typewritten copy was undated and unsigned. It appeared to be a child's account, perhaps from an orphanage reception. But there was no seal or name. One line was underlined 3 times in red pencil. I sat where they told me to, but I don't know what they saw when they looked at me. Corbin made no further comment. He just taped it up just above the projection wall between a faded map of Mercer County and a fragment of a sketchbook left over from St. Harmon's Abbey. Below on the attic floor, a small chair, the kind for small children, was turned toward the projector. That evening, the attic window no longer flickered as it had before, but the slide of the projector had been rearranged. Glass panel number 1 was now at the bottom. Panel number 7 was gone. And inside the lid, which had been blank, a new line appeared written in fresh ink. The initials E.C. Corbin's initials, but not his handwriting. By the end of July, Corbin's diary was no longer dated. Instead, each page began with the name of a county, along with short phrases, usually taken from a coroner's report or a marginal note in a parish burial register. Chair turned inward. Window not forced. There was no weathering on the pedestal. These fragments, decades apart and from different regions, seemed to begin to rearrange themselves under Corbin's gaze, not chronologically, but in a visual pattern. And what emerged from them wasn't a history, it was a symmetry. The first notice came quietly buried near the bottom of the Logan County Register, dated February of 1863. It described a fire brief, sudden and strangely partial, that had consumed only the back room of a modest tenant farmhouse. The tenant, a man named Jedediah Clay, had lived alone for years until 2 winters prior, when he took in a boy from the Lexington orphanage. That boy was never seen again. Jedediah himself escaped the flames without a scratch. The coroner's report was short and oddly unemotional, stating simply that no remains were recovered. There were no signs of ignition around the area, no burn marks, no scorched earth. Just one detail lingered: the boy's chair overturned in the kitchen, but untouched by fire. It sat beneath a window that had been raised 2 inches despite thick snow resting undisturbed on the sill. No footprints in the yard, no signs of anyone leaving or entering. The floor beneath the chair was cold intact, as if nothing had ever happened. Years later, Corbin would pin this article beside slide number 9. The image it referenced was black and white, slightly blurred, and achingly quiet. A slender boy sat by a frosted window, shoulders, drawn face unreadable. Behind him, a chair leg jutted out, unnaturally twisted mid-motion. His collar was crooked, and one foot, just one, hovered slightly above the floor the way children sometimes do when they haven't yet decided if they're welcome. You may find yourself holding your breath already. But this was just the beginning. 7 years passed. Then came the second entry, Casey County, autumn of 1870. A family returned home from harvest to find their youngest daughter missing from her bedroom. She was 7. The room was locked. Her shoes were still beneath the bed. The fire in the hearth had faded to coals. Nothing was stolen. Nothing disturbed. Only one thing was gone. A photograph once framed and hung above the mantel. A portrait of the girl and her mother. The nail remained in the wall. But there was no glass. No frame. No shards. The constable noted one detail. Only the wallpaper beside the fireplace bore a faint smudge as if brushed by a gloved hand. But no fingerprints were ever lifted. The girl never returned. In slide number 3, Corbin pointed to a reflection barely visible in the glass above another child's head. A girl this time, her expression weary, not afraid. The wallpaper behind her blue with delicate brass-colored paisley matched a sample Corbin had traced in a regional textile catalogue from the exact same year. The photograph's glass looked empty, but in the faint curve of its reflection, there appeared to be the shoulder of someone else, a child in a smocked dress, standing too close to explain. At this point, Corbin stopped cataloguing the incidents by name or location. Instead, he began grouping them by gesture. Open windows with no draft. Chairs turned slightly after a fire. Portraits missing nails still in place. Each detail on its own could have been dismissed, but they repeated quietly, insistently. These were not stories of typical loss. They came from rural counties scattered across Kentucky. Each case involved a child between the ages of 10 and 14. Everyone had been adopted, fostered, or unnamed entirely. And all had vanished not into some clear event, but into that hollow space between evidence and explanation. There was Owen County, 1845. Heavy rains that summer turned the Elkhorn Creek to flood. Several homes were lost. Among the presumed dead, a boy named Josiah. No surname recorded. His foster parents claimed he had never spoken not since arriving, though they knew he hadn't been born mute. He had a strange habit. He always sat facing the wall even when the room was empty. On the morning he disappeared, they found a basin of water at the foot of his cot. Full still, they hadn't filled it. The cot was dry. His footprints ended at the barn. A week later, a neighbor walking his property found a mason jar tucked inside the hollow of a tree. Dry, upright, sealed. Inside was a child's drawing. It showed a boy seated in a narrow room, one side of his face hidden in shadow. Slide 11, under dim light, revealed a nearly identical image. The boy sits in a beam of light, his left side completely obscured. Behind him, the outline of a basin. Beside that slide, Corbin wrote only one word. His handwriting, once steady and neat, had grown erratic. He switched to block letters, the kind archivists use when clarity outlives memory. One word. Again, in the final months of his research, Corbin stopped calling these children missing. He referred to them simply as subjects without redress. Not gone, not dead, just unacknowledged. He pinned maps to the attic walls, county by county, not connecting by location or time, but by visual alignment. Wallpaper curtain folds how the light fell where the shadows landed, And then something remarkable. The strings that connected each slide didn't loop back to the beginning. They moved forward, over and over. A spiral of restaging. Not memory repeating, but memory rehearsing. Corbin never wrote a final report. No summary. No theory. When a former colleague asked by post about the crates and borrowed books still unreturned, he received only a folded sheet in reply, a hand-drawn diagram of an empty room. No doors, no windows, just a square of light from nowhere, scrawled in ink along the margin, already seen, waiting again. The next morning, the envelope returned on its own. The post office clerk insisted no one had brought it in. Yet the postage was fresh. The ink of the postmark, still damp, dated just 1 day earlier. Corbin's house, you'll recall, remained locked. No one had passed through his gate. No mail carrier had approached. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Just one. It wasn't of Corbin, nor of any known child. Just a chair, turned toward a bare wall, and behind it, on the plaster, a single handprint. Small, upright, but there were no footprints leading to it. In early April of 1881, a letter arrived folded in thirds and sealed with thick black wax. A somber practice even in those times, more fitting for funeral announcements than academic requests. The letterhead bore the name of an obscure organization, the American Lantern Society, a group of traveling educators and visual historians based in Pittsburgh. Not particularly large, but known among collectors. The tone of the letter was formal, but behind the politeness, something flickered a sense of quiet urgency. It was signed by a man named E. Lawton, who claimed to be a curator for the society. He'd heard of Corbin's possession of the St. Harmon's device through a colleague in Lexington, and now he wished to examine it himself. He promised discretion, even offered to personally escort the lantern to an upcoming conference that June. But Corbin never responded. By then, the device had become central to his life, far beyond study. His notebooks no longer spoke in the language of analysis. Instead, there was only one ledger titled Interval Records. No dates, just slide numbers, and for each, the precise hour of projection, the state of the ambient light, and any alterations he noticed. But the tone had shifted. It no longer resembled academic notation. It read like ritual instruction. Slide 7, only view before sunrise. Slide 10, maintain complete silence. They weren't notes, they were rules. Then a second letter arrived, then a third. This time, delivered not by post, but by a young boy. He said only this: the man left it with my uncle in Danville. The handwriting had degraded more uneven, as though written in haste or pain. But the signature was the same. Lawton. This letter didn't ask for permission to borrow the device. Now, it requested a visit. Corbin, perhaps buying time, replied through the Harrodsburg telegraph office. Yes, he'd meet next Wednesday. But no, the lantern would not be moved. He was firm. The crate is not instructional, nor is it a relic. It is a closed circuit. Any removal breaks the condition of stillness. But the appointment never happened. That day, Corbin prepared. The lantern was returned to its crate, sealed again, with wax. The attic swept, windows blackened. The chair moved to face the wall, the same wall where the projector had once cast its dim, uneasy patterns. He waited. Morning became evening. Dusk settled in. Still no one came. At last, Corbin walked to the depot. The 11:40 coach from Lexington had arrived, the station agent confirmed. But no one had disembarked under the name Lawton, the boarding house where the guest was expected. No reservation, no inquiries, no unfamiliar guests. Puzzled but not yet shaken, Corbin wrote again, this time directly to the American Lantern Society. His question was straightforward. Was Mr. Lawton truly authorized to examine private collections? The reply came 3 weeks later. It was from the Society's secretary, Ada Kulive. Her letter was polite but final. No one named E. Lawton had ever been employed, contracted, or even associated with their organization. No letters had been sent to Mr. Corbin from their office at all in the past year. Corbin read it twice. Then he took the first letter, Lawton's original message, and turned it over. The black wax seal, thick and crude, was wrong. Not the Lantern Society's emblem, no torch and scroll. Instead, something simpler, a long rectangle. One end cross-hatched like a window, as though seen from the inside of a darkened room. He took a blade and scraped the wax, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was another mark, an impression, a looped curve intersecting itself. It looked almost like a child's drawing. Maybe a C, or maybe a mirror of Corbin's own initial. He copied the symbol into his notebook. Beneath it, he wrote, not a courier, a substitution. But what haunted him most wasn't the false identity, or the silence, or the photograph. No, what unsettled Corbin was the timing, the way the requests had arrived. Not randomly, not impulsively, but with perfect spacing. As though someone had been watching his days and knew exactly when he would be alone. We'll pause here, dear listener. Take a breath. And if you're still with us, perhaps you've begun to sense it too. The pacing, the shadows, the soft but careful threading of something just behind the veil of ordinary life. Stay close. The next chapter brings us deeper. The language of the correspondence was still the formal tone of the academic world, thoughtful, unfeeling but weighty, and the signature, though unchanged in content across 3 different examples, the final stroke of the signature tilted forward with each iteration as if the name were trying to complete itself somewhere else. Corbin's behavior changed gradually in the weeks that followed. The slide containing the photographs was no longer exposed. The projection wall, once covered with notes and markings, was completely erased. Only a single card remained carefully pinned to the center of the canvas, not for the eyes, for the memory. He cut off all contact with his former colleagues. An invitation from the Kentucky Historical Society was returned with just one line written in red pencil. No review allowed. Interpretation has begun. In a footnote, circled in the upper left corner without explanation, Corbin wrote, "It was never intended for presentation. This is not a performance. This is a rehearsal." The words give the reader pause. Rehearsal for what? There is no record of a Lawton. Yet, The Corbins' attic window, which had been closed for months, was unexpectedly found ajar one August morning. There was no sign of forced entry from the outside. A black soot trailed on the sill, not rising but trailing inward, and the chest, once sealed with wax, was now void of any seal, a single fingerprint clearly imprinted on the inside of the lid. The box had been sealed more carefully than anything time could have explained. 7 wax impressions had been pressed deep into the linen wrappings, solidifying into brittle, time-tarnished discs. There were no symbols, just smooth circles like coins worn by too many palms. Corbin always opened the chest sparingly, only opening the trays necessary to retrieve the slides. But one late August morning, he noticed something strange in the bottom row. One of the seals, the 4th, was not cracked, nor did it show any signs of being disturbed. It had split from the inside. A small crack extended, as if from a suppressed sigh. He noted the phenomenon in his notebook. Seal thus far, spontaneous rupture, interior temperature stable, no signs of fire. But he did not open the trays that day. Instead, he sat by the chest for hours, making notes about the weight of the lid, the roughness of the linen covering, and the smell. It was still the same mingled scent of beeswax and vinegar. But this time, there was something else added, a faint metallic scent, like rust dissolving in warm water. When he finally opened the lid, there was no hand-painted slide or stained glass inside as usual. Just a sheet of clear glass, brass-rimmed, polished, so perfect it was empty. Corbin thought it might just be an unused spacer, but the corner of the glass was engraved with the same number as the other's X12. Hesitantly, he placed the slide in the projector. The attic was already covered with wool blankets, the windows sewn shut with hemp rope. The darkness was complete, save for a faint beam of light from the projector. At first, there was nothing. No image, no shadow. Just a blank space. But then, a faint flicker. Not a mechanical fault, not a flickering light. A signal, a flicker, then fading, then a flicker, and with the light, a sound soft, intermittent, not wind, but too regular to be noise. Corbin described it as breathing, not from the lungs, but from within the memory. He stood motionless for nearly 20 minutes, observing the streak of light, not illuminating but chipping away at the darkness. The glass, when removed, was unremarkable. No image, no reaction under the magnifying glass. He scratched it lightly with a bone pen and nothing stuck. But when he replaced the glass and dimmed the light to a dull glimmer, the image reappeared. And the sound, not louder, but closer. It was as if the room itself had shrunk around him. Visitors to Corbin's attic a few weeks later described a sour, embalming smell mixed with beeswax and rotting wood. A carpenter called in to repair the ceiling beams refused to enter. The air stung my eyes, he said, and the light, it didn't want to stay still. When asked again, he shook his head, offering no further explanation. The bill for that visit was never sent. Elijah Corbin began to refer to the pain in his notebook not as slippage, but as interstice 12. His notes became fragmented. Fragments of thoughts scattered across the edges of the page. Not something seen, but something missed. A space between rooms. Not exactly darkness, but the space the children never looked back at. Corbin stopped timing each line. The flickering of the light from the lens no longer followed the clock on the wall, he said, but responded to intention. When he approached the question in his mind, the light pulsed faster. But when he approached certainty, it slowed down. In a short paragraph hastily etched into the inside back cover of the notebook, Corbin wrote, "The previous notes were documents. But this is a rehearsal space. There's nothing in there, but there's always something to look forward to." He tried to determine the pattern behind the flickering light. Did it repeat itself periodically? Did it respond to voices, light, or touch? Corbin placed random objects in front of the projector. A photograph, a child's shoe, the corner of a burned notebook page, all to no avail. But when he held a shiny tin mirror facing the projection, the light stopped for 6 seconds and then continued. The room didn't feel any colder, but it felt different. It wasn't the temperature that had dropped, it was the intention of the room that had changed. The next morning, the mirror was found face down on the floor. The tin frame was slightly bent, the reflection distorted, but not broken. When Corbin tried to record the incident in his notebook, the ink bled in an unusual way. The page under interstice 12 curled at the corners as if exposed to moisture. The attic was completely dry. He tore the page out, folded it, and placed it in the projector's case just below the strange slide. Corbin never wrote again on the subject. A few weeks later, a scrap of paper was found at the bottom of his desk drawer. It bore only one line. What if this isn't meant to show, but to invite what hasn't happened yet? The slide still showed no image, but if projected in absolute silence, the light would flicker like a held breath and always point toward the corner of the room that no one turned to look at. By the end of September, Corbin had stopped marking his entries with dates. Instead, he noted the slide number and the time of day, though the very concept of time had begun to blur in the attic above Chandler's Hollow. The windows were closed, the curtains pinned to keep out the drafts. The air smelled of vinegar and paraffin. As night fell, the silence was broken only by the soft hiss of the projector's knob and the soft click of a slide being placed in its brass track, a rhythm that repeated itself and became ritualistic. Slide 14 showed no new faces. Instead, it brought back a recurring image, at first random, then distinct. A girl in a red wool dress sitting in a straight-back chair near an off-center fireplace. She had appeared before on slide 5 and then again on slide 9. But this time her expression was hard. Her jawline was sharper. The hem of her dress seemed shortened, and most strikingly, the chair had shrunk. Whether it was the angle of view or the change in its origin, the legs were thinner. The floor seemed to be closer to the girl's knees. Corbin circled the image in a charcoal pencil and marked it Subject 5R. He added, "Not the same version, but the same obligation." The background was familiar wood-paneled walls, a lopsided picture frame, a patch of light from an unknown source. But everything had changed. The walls were narrowing the dark corners that had once been exposed. The space was tightening, and with that shrinking came a strange feeling. Not exactly fear, but the feeling that the glass was not just preserving memories, but editing them, repeating them, not for clarity, but for rehearsal. In entry 94, Corbin first called this phenomenon the shrinking effect. He noticed that in the repeated shots, objects like chairs, rugs, mantelpieces, etc., seemed to move forward, growing larger in the frame, While the figures gradually became smaller, their poses increasingly cramped. He measured the distance between the girl's shoulder and the wall behind her in 3 shots, and found that the spatial ratio had decreased by nearly a third, even though the angle of the shot had not changed. Corbin writes, "The box is not replaying a sequence. It is reshaping it." This is not a flashback. He no longer believed the slides were meant to be seen not as memories, not even as messages, but as rehearsals. They were reductions. He wrote each closer to its purpose, not for viewing, but reenactment. Entry 94 was rushed. The ink smudged across the lower margin as if he hadn't meant to stop writing. Around the text, tiny notes had been scratched into the corners, marginalia, desperate to tether meaning to shape. One showed another attempt to map the sequence of slides onto architectural plans from the old St. Hamon's facility. But this time, even Corbin admitted it didn't fit. The more he tried, the worse the alignment became. Rooms that had once mirrored the asylum's blueprints now warped. Their borders slipped, moldings vanished, door frames, migrated furniture displaced. In one image, a lamp perched on the right wall. In the next, a framed picture appeared in its place on the left, the lamp gone entirely. And always, somewhere in the frame, was her, the girl in red, unchanged in essence. Shifted in stance, to Corbin she became more than a presence, she became the index. Not a name, not even a person. A reference point. A symbol of return, not resolution. In later entries, he stopped describing what the slides depicted and began tracking how they thought, or rather how their sequence demanded interpretation. Entry 96 scrawled diagonally across the page like a warning, more than a statement, simply read, "She does not age. She adjusts." From that moment, Corbin was rarely seen outside. Neighbors whispered of flickering amber light through his attic curtains even during daylight. It was as if the projection no longer needed to be switched on, it persisted, waiting for someone to witness it. One afternoon, a local surveyor passing Corbin's property paused at the gate. He later recalled the sound of scraping, then distinct footsteps. Not one person, not 2, 3, perhaps more, pacing shifting. He did not linger. Inside, the attic floor had begun to buckle. The rug beneath the projection screen was gone, folded beneath a cot. In its place, freshly waxed burr floor gleaming. The chair had been moved again, but now it faced directly into the beam of the lantern, not to watch, but to occupy. As if someone or something was meant to sit there. No one had used the chair in days, yet the cushion held a faint depression unmoved. Beneath entry 94, written in minuscule script, so small it nearly disappeared into the page. Binding. Corbin left one final note. It doesn't record what happened. It shows what must keep happening. The repetition was not an accident. It was an insistence. The box was not saving memory. It was sculpting it, compacting space and time into something tighter, more absolute. The girl wasn't being remembered. She was being refined, distilled. Each slide pulled the room closer to one gesture, one posture, one unblinking light. And then one morning, something changed. A single slide was discovered inserted backwards in the tray. There was no label, but through the thin pane of glass, her red dress could still be seen, faint and ghost-like. Smaller now, mirrored. Her face turned ever so slightly toward the invisible beam as if awaiting instruction. It was the final slide in the second tray, hidden behind a linen lining, not meant to be removed. Corbin had only found it while cleaning soot from the crate's hinge. A shift in weight, a loose corner, and then a hidden groove barely the width of a fingernail. The glass, when extracted, was crude. No frame, corners filed down by hand, and in the lower left corner, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, a date, 1893. No initials, no seal, no additional text. Just the year, faint, smudged, still unmistakable. He didn't project it right away. Instead, he held it up near the attic window, letting the weak morning light fall through. He turned it slowly, adjusting the angle, and then a silhouette, arches and faces, children. 8, maybe 9, standing, not seated. Backs half turned as if awaiting someone something just outside the frame. The floor gleamed polished wood. The ceiling disappeared into shadow. In the far corner, hanging nearly out of sight, a hand-carved cruciform. Narrow, unpainted. It was a chapel. He knew it, but not one he'd ever seen. Not one recorded in any records from Mercer or Washington County. The exposed beam configuration had only just begun appearing in ecclesiastical designs around 1890. But what caught his eye, what froze him in place, was the iron communion rail. It bore 3 curved rings. That detail appeared in exactly one set of blueprints, the chapel of St. Wesley's, and its foundation hadn't even been poured until late 1891. This slide somehow showed a place that didn't yet exist. 2 weeks later, under the pretense of documenting rural ecclesiastical geometry for a visual archive, Corbin requested the full St. Wesley's blueprints from the diocesan office in Lexington. When they arrived, he compared every measurement: beam curvature, floor slope, window alignment. Perfect. A slide found hidden in soot-dusted wood had captured in still light a moment that would not be built for another 4 years. The projection revealed what the eye had only whispered. When the old glass slide was inserted into the lantern and the lens adjusted, a pale, scented image bloomed on the canvas. The sanctuary barren and still in construction, yet somehow impossibly filled with children. At first the light trembled as though uncertain. Perhaps it was the age of the glass or something subtler, like the hesitance of memory. But then the image steadied. The sanctuary walls stood raw and unadorned, the wooden pews not yet installed. Faint dust outlines on the floor traced where the benches were intended to go. And there in the foreground, partially cloaked in shadow, stood a boy, roughly 10 years old, one arm raised, fingers poised mid-motion as if to adjust a collar that wasn't there. Corbin at first felt no recognition, but then the angle of the shoulder, the slight curve of the jaw, the narrow way the chin tipped down, it all struck something deep, something remembered. He rummaged through his personal ledger and unearthed a letter dated 1862. A family document. A simple list of names, those buried in the Waverly Hollow plot. Among them, Simon C. Corbin, stillborn. No birth certificate, no announcement. Just a brief pencil mark from the attending midwife, no breath, no cry. The name never made the registry, and yet, this boy in the slide, he bore Corbin's nose. The same subtle slope, the same tilt of the right ear. On his shirt, faint and only just visible beneath the neckline, a stitched S threadbare, almost ghost-like. Journal entry 102 reads, "If this is prophecy, it lacks witness. If record, it is not from this time." But he is not misplaced. He is rehearsed. Let that settle for a moment, dear viewer. This wasn't merely a photograph. Not to Corbin, it was a visitation, a contradiction. Now the slide, a clear image of a sanctuary not completed until 1893, was found within a sealed crate marked no later than 1859. That inconsistency, Corbin never discussed it, not in public, not even in correspondence. In fact, he'd already severed ties with the archivists in Lexington. Told the local surveyor that the attic was being fumigated. By this stage, Corbin had stopped seeking answers. He was no longer trying to prove anything. He was simply following. His journals grew stranger. No longer entries but fragments, marginal notes, reverse inheritance, unstaged future, built for those not born. He stopped labeling the slides by number. Instead, he gave them titles, not records, but insistences, objects that weren't discovered but that insisted themselves into being. In one particularly cryptic line he wrote, "The image has not arrived early, it has returned early. It has already happened somewhere that did not require the chapel to be built, only believed in." One page written sideways along the paper grain bore a single sentence. The foundation was poured in 1891, but the room waited much longer. This slide, this image of the boy, was never returned to the crate. Instead, Corbin stored it in a hollowed-out copy of the Book of Hours. He wrapped the book carefully in cotton, tied it with string, and tucked it onto the highest shelf in his study, between a Mercer County census and a manual on glass tinting. Inside the book cover, faintly scrawled in graphite, was a question. If the dead may be projected, what of those still unsummoned? The boy in the slide never turned. He never acknowledged the viewer. He remained still unyielding. And when Corbin lit the lantern again a week later, the communion rail in the image had vanished. The cruciform behind the altar, however, had darkened. By the spring of 1895, Elijah Corbin's name had quietly disappeared from every official record. Absent from the census since 1893. Removed from land ledgers without notice. No one came to claim the property. No will surfaced. It was as if the house had chosen to unremember him. Once documented as a modest clerical residence with attached study and attic, the house now resisted even description. It had become a structure sealed not by law, but by silence. It wasn't until a neighbor reported water leaking from an upstairs shutter trickling across the porch for nearly a week that anyone gained entry. County Magistrate Edwin R.S., accompanied by a locksmith and a tradesman from Harrodsburg's lantern works, forced open the study door. Inside, the air was dry and bitter, still, as if the rooms had been holding their breath. The rugs had been rolled up and stacked along the wall. The fireplace was empty, save for a single iron nail embedded in the back. Some item had once been mounted, they're hastily removed. The attic door was locked from within. They forced it open with a chisel, and there, under a slant of afternoon light, was the room Corbin had preserved meticulously. A cot stripped of linens, a journal half open. The page displayed only a crude drawing of a child's chair and an X marked behind its shadow. At the room's center, perfectly aligned with an unlit projection cloth, stood the lantern box. It hadn't been used in some time. Yet, The air held the faint, unmistakable scent of heated glass and copper vapor. Dust lay thick across the floor and furniture, but not on the lantern tray, not on the slide cradle. Those remained clean, untouched, or perhaps recently used. The tradesman Jasper Tull approached the lantern, but something about the atmosphere stopped him cold. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he stood quietly, eyes fixed on the glass slide, still resting in place, and in that charged, unmoving silence, Sleepy History Tales invites you to consider if memory can be captured on glass, whose future might it already contain. He noted first that the brass was still faintly warm, not from the sun, nor from any nearby source of heat, but with the deep, persistent warmth of something not extinguished, only recently closed. A presence lingered in its metal frame. When Tull leaned forward to inspect the focusing lens, he hesitated. What he saw he later described in a written deposition to the magistrate submitted weeks after the incident. It threw a shadow, he wrote, but not mine. I wasn't between the lens and the cloth. Still a figure appeared, smaller than me. The arms weren't raised in menace, they lifted slowly, like reaching, not up but downward, or toward something. Light that hadn't yet arrived. There had been no lamp beneath the lantern, no oil, no flame, yet it cast light. Thin, pale, utterly cold. A projection that didn't brighten its surroundings, only revealed them. Tull backed away. He never touched the machine again. The shadow vanished as soon as he moved. Magistrate R.S. catalogued the slide tray with precision. Of the original glass slides listed in Corbin's ledger, only 8 remained. 5 were missing. One had broken, cleaved neatly through its center, not shattered by impact, but seemingly split by pressure from within. Another had been reversed in its frame. The image, now faint and backward, bore the same boy seen in earlier entries, seated, turned now to face the viewer. His expression, once unreadable, had softened, but his hands were gone. Not marred, not erased, simply absent. The floor showed shadows where arms should have been, but no visible limbs cast them. A sealed envelope was later discovered beneath the cot, bound in linen tape. Inside was a single page torn from Corbin's ledger, folded into thirds. Across the top, in block letters, was written, "The box casts something forward, not light, something that learns." There was no elaboration. The line stood alone, underlined once like a warning or a confession. When the projection cloth was examined in oblique light, never daylight, it revealed signs of wear. Not from handling, nor from heat, but from pressure. Across its lower third, small indentations appeared, evenly spaced, as if something had leaned into it again and again. From the direction of the lantern, they resembled the marks left behind by fingers. The county closed the case of Corbin's disappearance with the bland finality of bureaucracy. Presumed perished, cause unknown. Property held pending further claim. The box Corbin's lantern was locked in a municipal storage room for 6 years, then quietly misplaced. No repair ticket, no follow-up, nothing. In 1902, a clerk inventorying unclaimed property reported an unmarked case, no documentation, no tags, no paperwork. When opened, it held a cloth-wrapped object and a single envelope addressed only to whomever opens this first. Inside was a photograph, blurred, discolored, likely overexposed. It depicted a small dust-covered room. In the center, a man sat on a wooden chair, his arms extended, fingers indistinct, motionless. But behind him, projected on the wall in a faint cone of light, was a second silhouette, upright, smaller, reaching forward. When county officials finally entered Corbin's former residence under court order, they found no signs of violence, no struggle, no forced exit. The back door had been bolted from the inside. The attic shutters were nailed shut inwardly. Dust blanketed every surface except one. Beneath the north-facing window, the wooden desktop bore the unmistakable sheen of repetition. It had been wiped and wiped again, perhaps every day. The grain flattened by palms, wrists, the slow drag of ink-stained fingers. The chair before it had not been moved in weeks. Its rear leg had left a shallow groove across the pine floor, evidence of hours spent seated, shifting just enough to leave a mark, but never rising. On the desk lay a notebook, calfskin bound, tied with a length of lampwick. The corners were worn soft from handling, its cover darkened with use. But the binding remained strong. It wasn't Corbin's formal ledger, nor his correspondence journal. This one was smaller, unlabeled, private. Tucked into its back cover was a tri-folded paper, faintly embossed with the Chapel Sun logo, Lantern Optics, Harrodsburg. Not a receipt. A catalogue. Slides for children's learning alphabet scenes, moral devotions, common images. Its margins had been overwritten in thick, deliberate pencil. At the bottom of the page, beneath a drawing of a boy leading a lamb through a garden, Corbin had scrawled his final note. There was no date, no signature, but the handwriting. The slope of the S in seeing matched other entries. The graphite was pressed deeply into the page, almost tearing it. It read, "If they appear again, do not see them. They are not remembering. They are repeating you." It made little sense alone. But in the context of the final pages, it grew more troubling. The last entries were sparse. Gone were the meticulous notes on light angles or slide dimensions. Instead, single lines in faint graphite written so lightly they barely remained. One page read, "They are ahead but not forward. Another repetition requires likeness, not consent." And finally, scrawled diagonally across the lower margin of a page, otherwise blank, the final legible thought before the catalogue entry. The attic does not contain them. It rehearses them. More than the words, it was the object nestled in the folds of Corbin's notebook that unsettled the county magistrate. A photograph. Not a studio portrait, but a contact print taken from a glass negative, raw and immediate. It showed a child, mid-turn, seated in profile near a tall window with no curtains. The face was blurred perhaps by movement or a delay in the shutter, but the collar, the hands, even the faded wallpaper in the background, all matched one of Corbin's recorded slide images. Slide 3. Now missing. That slide had once shown a girl, parted hair, faint smile, seated in a room whose design couldn't be matched to any known orphanage or school. But in this photograph, she wasn't quite in profile anymore. Her head turned just slightly, her gaze drifting toward where the camera had been. A subtle break in symmetry. A shift from subject to witness. She had seen the lens. There was no date on the photo, no studio stamp, just a faint fingerprint pressed into the top right edge, too small to be Corbin's. The lantern found beside the cot was sealed in an iron lockbox under magistrate's order. The seal bore the crest of the Harrodsburg Historical Commission, though the order itself was unsigned. It was placed in municipal storage and never opened again. Its disappearance in 1902 remains unaccounted for. The attic room was never leased again. The next tenant, a schoolteacher from Springfield, reported hearing the floorboards creak in regular intervals around dawn. She lived alone. When asked what the sound resembled, she answered softly, "It sounds like someone waiting to be seen." Corbin's notebook, however, remains in the county archive. Its pages have since been scanned for digital preservation. But the faint graphite notes near the end resist clear capture smudging under digital light, as if some element of motion remains encoded in the strokes themselves. Some claim the notes respond differently under certain lamps. Others dismiss it as aging ink and brittle paper. But one detail remains consistent. The catalogue page where Corbin wrote his final warning curls at the edges, not from touch, but as if closed by breath, and beneath the illustration of the lamb, a new imprint has emerged, barely visible, only under angled light, a name, not listed in any registry, but written with the calm assurance of something that had always been there. Though the lantern was officially catalogued under the Kentucky Historical Ledger Committee, it appears in no published listings. Its crate, item A26, marked non-circulating, was transferred to restricted archives in 1903, where it sits locked behind two brass clasps and a drawer labeled Visual Media Unprocessed. The lantern itself has not been used since 1895. Yet each time it's inventoried, archivists report the same unsettling fact: the interior chamber remains faintly warm to the touch. The slides, however, tell a more fragmented story. Of the original tray, 11 glass plates survive. 3 shattered during recovery. 2 were lost during the 1912 recataloguing. But one remains, different, a final slide, wrapped in linen, hidden beneath a false divider. It has never been projected, at least not officially. Its number is absent from all logs. The only mention lies on a small handwritten card tucked between the pages of Corbin's final ledger, yellowed, edges brittle, the ink faded but legible. It reads, "Do not project unless someone is willing to forget themselves." The slide bears no markings, no number etched into its edge, no wax label. Its color differs subtly. The pigment seems embedded beneath the glass, not painted atop it. The corners are uneven, as if trimmed by hand. It's heavier than the others by nearly half an ounce. Attempts to digitize it have failed. Modern light sources reveal nothing. Scanners return only distortion interference patterns that flicker and collapse into blankness. In 1987, a technician described the resulting image as a breathing grid, though the phrase was dismissed in the official report. Another attempt in 2004 using infrared composite imaging revealed a ghostly gray, matrix rows of seated figures. No depth, no features. The image was not archived. The projector resists study as well. Its brass remains strangely untarnished. When briefly examined in 1962 by a visual optics consultant from Georgetown College, the internal mirror housing was described as unnaturally clean. No dust, no corrosion. Even after decades, the light source, when activated with a standard acetylene lamp, emitted no heat. Yet, a projection sheet placed 15 feet away flickered faintly. Even in total darkness, archivist Diavoraran stood between the lens and the cloth during that test. She saw no image, but later wrote, "I knew where to stand," and it felt familiar. Her note was entered under subjective observation, then quietly closed without follow-up. The final slide referred to in internal memos only as Plate X was last handled during a 2011 inventory migration. The linen wrap had grown stiff with age, but the plate remained intact. Its surface bore a faint outline. A door, barely visible, only at sharp angles in natural light. No known architecture matches it. The proportions are off. The door is too narrow. No hinges, no knob. Just a round aperture in its center, like a lock or an eye. Pressed beneath the linen was a second card, possibly added later. The handwriting does not match Corbin's. One line appears written in red pencil. If someone sees it, the sentence trails off unfinished, the pencil stroke disappearing into the fold, as if the writer had meant to return, but never did. Since then, no official record exists of anyone attempting to project Plate X. Not from fear, but from something else. A quiet uncertainty about the lantern's purpose. It's no longer considered an educational tool, nor a historical artifact. It exists now in the space between function and ritual, not broken, not forgotten, only paused. The slide remains wrapped. The lens remains clean, and once each year during inventory, the archivist assigned to the crate is asked a final question, spoken aloud by policy. Are you willing to be the viewer this year? So far, no one has said yes. And yet, when the SE8 crate was last opened, the linen wrap was looser than before. And the projector's mirror, though untouched, reflected someone sitting. Though no one had entered the room, the box remains sealed. The slides remain unscanned. And still, somehow, somewhere, light finds a way to project what memory refuses to hold. If this story stayed with you, if it flickered in your mind long after the light faded like the video, and subscribe to Sleepy History Tales, we'll be waiting for the next story, the one we were never meant to see.